I'm making this video today because I wanted to talk a little bit about how to set up a multi-language form. And I've had a lot of people ask me these sorts of questions. Forms Experience Builder by default does not have the ability to set the label of certain objects in the UI. It's a feature that we hope to have in the future, but right now there is no easy way to do it. And yet you can do it with JavaScript as long as your builder config.properties has the secure JS property set to false. And I've written some helper functions that will enable us to do that, and I wanted to show you those helper functions in action. So and then what I've also done is built an application that can be used by anyone to very quickly create a multi-language form. I'm going to show you an example of one of those today. And so when I launch my form right now, I have it configured to show me French, Spanish, and English. And as I select the different language options, you can see that the text label for the widget is changing. And close that form, and I'm going to show you how it's done. So the first thing is that it is dependent on this multi-language form that I built. And if we click on the view responses, you'll see that there's a multi-language strings database. And the way I set this up is that for every instance of this form, it will keep track of all of the strings for each form that you want to use this. So the critical fields here, we have an application ID and a form ID, and then for every object that's in that form, we specify the object type. Most of them are going to be fields, but there are a few extra types here. So when in doubt, just select field, and then if necessary, there will be an index. And as this states, an index only applies to the survey header and the page navigator and the tabbed folder, I think, as well. So then you select your language, and you can, if you have more languages than this, you can always edit this particular form and add them to the drop down here. And then this is the actual label text that you want to enter. Once you've added, and as you can see in here, I've got label text for a bunch of different objects in this particular form. Once you have added them, you can click this Generate Array Content, which will actually convert this table into an array structure that will be used in our implementation. The sample form that I just showed you is here, so the only strings that I have are the English, French, and Spanish for the one name field. But if I wanted to add another field to that form, then I would just come over here to this and add my new item ID, add the strings for that item, and then generate my array content, and then update the form. So now let's edit my sample application and see what pieces are required to make this work. The first thing that we want to do is we want to capture the app ID, the form ID, and then this multi-line field is going to contain that generated array with all of the strings. So the app ID, the form ID, we can actually calculate, and I have some fancy little code that can be used by everyone. So the set app ID, you just have to take this line here and replicate it, and I've provided that in my example source code. Same with the field, the form ID is set here by doing the form.getID JavaScript function. Something to note about the set app ID is that in version 8.5 we actually have a get app UID function, but for 8.0 we didn't have that, and so you can use what I wrote here. And then we call a service, and the service is going to query the multi-lang string application to return that array content, and I can show you that here. We'll just quickly look at the service configuration. You can see that for an input I'm linking the app ID and the form ID, and then the output was only grabbing the array content and placing it into the contains the strings field. So we create that service, we create the app ID, form ID, and the multi-line field. You can also see that I've made this section invisible by using this little bit of JavaScript, item.setVisible false, and that is on the onShow event, so that will be unseen to the user. The third bit here is you add my JavaScript that has the helper functions, and you don't necessarily need to know what those functions are doing. They're just going to be used by the overall code to change the labels when you're switching from language to language. And then you just have to determine where you call that function. And in this case, I'm calling the function in the on-item change of the select. So I'm calling my set language function, and I'm passing it the language that I want to set to. Now, maybe a more practical implementation of this might be you want to pass the language over the URL parameter. So you would, instead of getting the value of this select, you would get the value of the URL parameter, maybe the lang parameter, whatever you want to specify in the URL. And in that way, then, instead of in the on-item change, it would be in the on-form load, set the language to the value passed in on the URL. But this serves as a good example to what can be done. And then if I want to, say, add another field, and in this case, let's say I'm not going to know all of the French terms for it, but I'm just going to put sample text, and I'm going to check the ID because I'm going to need that, and I'm just going to change it to f_sample. Save this and click manage, and I'm going to deploy that change. And then over here, I'm going to, sorry, that's the wrong one. I'm going to click on view responses, and I'm going to load the multi-lang strings form for this particular application. And I'm going to put in my new ID. It's a field. My English is going to be sample. Click add label text, French, and I'm going to say French sample. And then I'm going to add my Spanish sample. Click add text. We're going to click the generate array content and then update the form. Now that the form has been updated, if I come back and I launch my sample form, I should be able to see my strings changing, and there they are. So here you can see that with using the main application, you can very quickly create new forms, define the strings for those forms, all the form items, and then present a multi-language form into your Forms Experience Builder environment.